because the banks need to be liquid, they tend to invest in a lot of bonds, and this action by the government is just undermining the whole banking system. I think I got some insight and gives you an idea how long inflation will last. It will last until that bill is paid. Does it give you a way of thinking about it? Because the central bank will dutifully support the government's offer. They always do. And that's the problem. God, you don't want the government screwing around with supply chains. I mean, come on. The market will take care of that because there's a bottleneck somewhere, and that price will rise and tend to cure that bottleneck. You just want to get out of the way and let the markets work.
Welcome to the Performance Initiative Podcast.
Our goal is to provide you and ourselves with the tools to be the best versions of ourselves.
We are your hosts, Dr. Grant Cooper
and Dr. Zinovy Meyler. We just wrapped up a conversation with Vernon Smith.
Vernon Smith needs no introduction for economists out there, but for everyone else, he's an American economist, professor of business economics and law at Chapman University. He was formerly a professor of economics at the University of Arizona, professor of economics and law at George Mason University, a board member of Mercatus Center. Notably, along with Daniel Kahneman, Vernon shared the 2002 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his contributions to behavioral economics.
Yes, and to say that he's a wealth of knowledge is to say nothing.
It's his understatement.
Yes. If you want to know about housing bubble, if you're interested in whether the dollar will remain the currency of the world,
should you be investing in stocks? Should you be investing in the housing? What do you think about the bailouts, inflation, deficits? It's on and on,
yes.
including sprinkling, and not even sprinkling, but really getting into Adam Smith and
the wisdom of Adam Smith and how it permeates our economy as well as psychology and society at large.
I learned a lot in this conversation. I think you did too.
Yes. It was great to learn things that are philosophically intriguing and interesting, and at the same time really applicable.
Yes. Enjoy. Vernon, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. Our podcast is about how to help people become the best versions of themselves. In order for them to do that, it's really important to understand the world in which we're all navigating. In order to understand the world, it's really helpful to understand economics, right? So that we can better understand how we fit into everything. So we're really excited to have one of the world's foremost experts on economics to talk with. We have a lot of questions, as we mentioned before we started rolling. We thought maybe we could start by asking you about social safety nets. And in particular, you were born in 1927. You lived through the Great Depression. Your mom was an avowed socialist on the one hand. And on the other hand, your dad, it seems like, wouldn't accept any government help in the form of the WPA during the Great Depression. So we were wondering, how do you think about the New Deal? And more broadly, how do you feel about social safety nets from the government?
Oh, well, I'm not opposed to them, let me put it that way. On the other hand, I'm not championing them or anything. And I think it very much depends upon how it's done. Now, the narrative, the story you told that my father refused to go on welfare after he was laid off, and it was not unusual in those days for people to feel that it was demeaning to accept government help. That was not, that you should be able to find work on your own. And he, and in fact, he did get back. He was a machinist and worked for the Bridgeport Machine Company. They made oil field equipment. And of course, there's lots of drilling in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, that were, and a lot of rigs that were served by Bridgeport Machine Company. And so he got back on within, I think, in less than a year, first part-time, every other week, and after a few months, he got on full-time. So we didn't suffer economically like a lot of people did. But my father, although he only had an eighth grade education, had these skills that were valuable. And he grew up in he was born in Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, which is near Pittsburgh, I believe, a suburb of Pittsburgh, I think. And his father was what was called a tool dresser in the oil fields. Now, this was before, for people that have any familiarity with the oil industry, this is before the Hughes tool bit. Hughes had an incredible breakthrough in creating a very, very hard tool bit that could grind through rock with and not and you didn't have to pull it out frequently in order to change the bit or else dress it. And to dress a used tool, you use just hand files and stuff to sharpen it, and that's what my grandfather did, and that's how he got to Kansas, because that was very high paying work. If you have an oil strike, there's no one in the neighborhood who's a tool dresser. So there was first this Tulsa oil strike in 1950, and that's what took my grandfather, why he left Pennsylvania, because the Pennsylvania fields were old. They weren't drilling that much. They were most producing. They were producing wells, and once you're producing, you don't usually drill that many more. And so he went to Tulsa and worked there and commanded a very high wage. And then there was a strike in Riverton, Wyoming. He moved there, and again, getting high wages. And then there was a strike in El Dorado, Kansas, which is only about 20 miles from Wichita. And then he ended up retiring there. Well, I mean, he stopped work. He was maybe 50 or 55, but he had earned very high income, and he was a real penny pincher. He saved every nickel, almost every nickel he earned. And so then he just quit, bought some rental property, and ended up when the Depression came, that really crimped very much his income. And so he had some problems, and he would work part-time, although not tool dressing. So that's sort of the history of my father's side of the family. And of course there was just very high work ethic, but there was nothing unusual about that. Everyone you knew had a high and strong work ethic and saving ethic. I mean, I first went to work when I was 12 years old, delivering for a local, on my bicycle for a local drugstore. And so I made 50 cents working from 6 p.m. at night until midnight. From 6 to p.m., that's 6 hours. So that's about 8 cents an hour. Wow, I'd never made so much money. I was very happy with that. And of course I lived at home, so I saved it. And then in that job, I learned to operate an old-fashioned soda fountain. Between deliveries, I would jerk sodas, as we used to say. Well, my next job, and I was now 14, was managing a fountain for a drive-in. And wow, I got $1 a day.
Nice.
And eventually, and then
Yeah.
was raised from I don't know, $5 a week to 7 or something like that. So I was early in the labor market, and it's interesting because the fact that I had a work record, I was able to go to work for Boeing aircraft in Wichita, and I was just 16 years old. Well, uh, you see, child labor was, what's that? I mean, uh, all kids wanted to work, and it was dignified, and that was something to be proud of, to be uh, to be enough in demand by some business that you could get a job, and of course retailing was a very common entry level work for unskilled people. It still is, and that was very negatively impacted by minimum wages. There was a minimum wage when I had been in, I think it started in 1938. There was a minimum wage of 25 cents, but retailing was exempt because it would have just wiped out retail.
You think that the minimum wage was a net positive for everyone, or do you think that?
Well,
Yeah.
I've never been a fan of minimum wages. Because it really, the problem is that all kinds of young people are perfectly happy to work for less than the minimum wage because you are learning. A lot of it is educational, and that work experience enables you then to get a higher wage. And the problem with the minimum wage, if you don't do something about to relax it at the entry level, is that it blocks entry, and all kinds of young people are hurt because they don't get into the work, but they work growth dynamic
Right.
process. Um, so I've always looked back upon that and was very grateful, you see, that no one said I couldn't go to work because I was only 12 years old. And in fact, at age 16, I applied at Boeing and was accepted. Well, I had 4 years work experience on my record, you see. So I was considered someone who was a good bet, you see. And so I fit right in. I had taken electricity and magnetism in high school, so I learned about and worked on what was called the central fire control system in the B-29. The B-29 was the first high altitude pressurized bomber, and so the personnel were all in pressurized sections of the airplane, and the gun sights you operated. That is, as you moved the gun sight up and down and back and forth, it moved a turret in the same way that was out in a non-pressurized portion of the plane. So I learned and worked on the whole problem of adjusting and calibrating that system, because you want the guns to point to the same place that the gun sight, your sight, is pointing at, and of course they're separated. So you need to. The question is that what you want to set that so that they come together about where the typical of enemy aircraft is. So I learned all that, and it was an incredible experience for me because in a variety of different ways. For example, the B-29 was the first uh, airplane that Boeing built that had not been first thoroughly tested
Hmm.
and improved and tested and improved. And then you finally get a production model and you go into production. There was, this was a bomber that was going to be used in the Pacific. And it was long range, high speed. The B-17, the B-24 bombers that were used in Europe were quite unsatisfactory for the Pacific because they didn't have the range or the speed. So the B-29 was designed for the Pacific theater. And moreover, its production started before the design was finished. And they basically just modified them depending upon the state of assembly in the assembly line, the modification would be introduced there. The ones ahead of that didn't have the modification, and they were sent to a modification center. The first thing a B-29 did was to take off and fly to a modification center so it could be made to look more like the ones that are earlier in the assembly line. So, and I look back, it was incredible, because you just had this continuous monitoring, feedback, and modification going on as that airplane was built. And there were a lot of trouble, they had for a while problems of engine fires. And that was, Boeing didn't build the engine. That was Curtiss Wright. Later, GE built those engines. So that had to be fixed. And it was just, you were just constantly fixing and modifying things. And,
Do you think that this?
work.
Oh, sorry. Was this kind of work ethic that you had and that people seem to have maybe more commonly in those days? Was that in part, you think, because there was no social safety net, that you were sort of, it was sort of sink or swim, and so people knew they had to?
Oh, yes. Oh, I think so. And by the way, it's also not true that there was no safety net. They were private. There were
Yeah.
all kinds of private initiatives to help people all over the place. When I was in intermediate school, that's that's grades 7, 8, and 9, and then you'd go to high school, which was just 3 years, 10, 11, and 12. Right close to Allison Intermediate, just a couple of blocks away, was the Masonic Orphans Home. The Masons had an orphan home. I had 2 classmates that were orphans, a girl and a boy. They were fine students.
Yeah.
They weren't a problem any more than I was or other kids that age were. I mean, they were very very well behaved, and I often have looked back upon that and realized how those systems all got usurped by the government program, and people would go to the government programs, and so there was a lot less diversity. These private programs varied quite a bit because people were experimenting. They were operating on different classes of people that needed help, women versus men and handicapped, all the different forms of handicap. And, and handicapped people work. There was, there would be some skill you could learn that provided you with market value. And I think there is a certain pride in that comes with that kind of of a background that we may very well have that has perhaps has been compromised. Uh,
Do you feel
and
that was
because
compromised by the government taking over and sort of unifying all of those safety nets?
well, yes, and not you know a better program, a better thing for the government maybe to have done was to provide some supplemental help to some of these private organizations. And when the government tries to do stuff itself, it just usually is a disaster.
Friends, we hope you're finding value in the content. If you're enjoying what you're watching, please consider hitting the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on the notification button to stay up to date with everything going on in the channel.
Speaking of that, how do you feel about the way, let's say, the most recent example would be the stimulus checks during the pandemic?
The pandemic. Yes. Well, that's top-down rules based upon no information. And the information isn't at the top, it's at the bottom. Individuals are the ones that are experiencing the effects of COVID, and they're not incompetent. People, can make adjustments and learn, and the government might, the government might have a role in somehow finding a way to facilitate that, but not run it. You see, the government doesn't try to make airplanes and tanks. They just write checks to private industry, and they do it. Otherwise, we have a formidable military machine, but it's not because it's only because the government is good at writing checks after having people bid in and get low bidders. There's procedures for doing that. But one of my favorite examples of the government really being quite incompetent in trying to run stuff is the veterans hospitals. The veterans hospitals, and they were plagued by corruption and all kinds of problems, and they just weren't any. They finally just let veterans choose whether they wanted to go to a veterans hospital or a private hospital, and the government just pays for it. Well, as a result, that helped to shape up the veterans hospitals because they now had to compete. It's almost a no-brainer, a simple model and where you subject stuff to competition and entry, and you get better than the entrants that are challenging you and handle them, or you don't. If you don't get better, you go out of business, and if you do, you stay in business.
You mentioned that the government is very good at writing checks. Is there a point at which we have to worry that they've written too many checks? Like, are we coming to a precipice where our debt ratio
Well,
is...
yes, and I think that's kind of a growing problem because governments, if you read The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith has chapters. There's a fairly long chapter on coinage, and the temptation of government monopolies of the coinage to debase the coinage. In other words, depreciate it, but because it's a monopoly, people still have to use it, and the government then paying their bills doing that rather than taxing. Well, the modern version of that, and we saw this in COVID when government spending started to soar, and let's see, I guess 22, 23. So the government, Biden administration was spending much larger sums of money, and the Federal Reserve would go into the open market and buy bonds in the open market to soften up that market so that when the new issue came, the public would hold it. Meantime, the Federal Reserve is holding these things they bought on this balance sheet. So it's basically, indirectly, they're just, it's the equivalent of printing money. It's the,
Yeah.
it's the equivalent of debasing the coinage, except it involves checking deposits rather than coins, because people don't, you don't buy much anymore with coins. You buy it by writing checks. And so I think that's very dangerous, because it means the Federal Reserve, together with the government, create a situation where the politicians have no budget constraint. You see, if whatever they want to spend, the Federal Reserve is willing to create the money to finance that, then there's no budget constraint. What's to limit government? None. But of course, what happens is we get inflation. You see, that's and in fact, I realized I had kind of an insight on inflation that I'd never had before, in sort of observing that process the last few years, and I realized that what the economic function of inflation is to essentially depreciate asset value enough to pay for that original government consumption. That is, think about, where do the resources come from? You see, if they tax to get the resources, then people have to give up income and they spend less for goods and services, and now the government does the spending. So you can just, it's kind of obvious how that works. Well, but suppose the money just comes out of the inkwell, that you just create the money to do this.
Proof.
But still, real resources have to be used to provide the goods and services to satisfy that government consumption demand. Well, it comes from depreciating asset values enough to pay for it. And what are the assets that depreciate? Well, anything that's denominated in a fixed annuity. You see, all bonds, state, federal, corporate bonds are denominated. You float the bond issue, and then the bond holders are receiving now an income from that.
Yeah.
Well, with inflation, that makes it easier to pay that income. Because you're paying them off with cheaper dollars. So it's really, you're fleecing the bondholders.
Yeah.
You're taking real resources from them. But
that's what almost sunk the community banks, right?
What's that?
That's what almost sunk the community banks when they started to go under, because they had these bonds that became worthless.
Well, yes, and of course because the banks need to be liquid, they tend to invest in a lot of bonds, and this action by the government is just undermining the whole banking system.
Yeah.
Like by devaluing, you see, the asset, a principal asset that they hold. But you see, also all rental contracts, insurance contracts, these are all denominated, and so those so inflation sucks real resources, real wealth out of all of those forms, because somehow that original, you have to release the labor and capital it takes to provide that, to produce that the original consumption demand from government. And so I think I got some insight, and gives you an idea how long inflation will last. It will last until that bill is paid. That is, it gives you a way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And of course, you read the newspapers, and it's all about the Federal Reserve is raising the interest rates, and how much more are they going to raise it and everything. That's not the point. If they did nothing, the inflation would eventually stop, because you eventually pay that bill. So it gives you a way of you see, thinking about what the economic role of inflation is, why it occurs, and some way of of thinking about what would eventually stop it, why it might stop on its own.
It seems though that the more we spend and deflate the, have inflation deflate the assets, the more we spend. So you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like we just keep on, it's like, oh, we're getting away with this, so let's do more of it. With that mindset,
Well,
do we ever get to a point where it just stops, where the inflation, or are we just on this runaway train?
well, I don't think the government is not well incentivized to stop it. It's
That's what I mean.
always, yeah, it's always a problem. Congress doesn't like to raise taxes. You don't get votes by raising people's
Right.
taxes, so they don't want to do that. And an easier thing to do is just let the Federal Reserve monetize the stuff. And but you see, and also you see that lowers the burden of the debt. People keep saying,
Yeah.
"Well, how will we ever pay off this debt?" Well, I'll tell you how we'll pay off that debt. We'll inflate out of it so that it's small enough that that we're able to handle it. That's always the way it's going to be done.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
during the Second World War, we had a period of 4 or 5 years that were very much like COVID, except that people were working. Everybody was working,
Mm.
but they were producing stuff you couldn't buy. They're building tanks and cannons and airplanes, and so you can't buy them. So what did you do with your money? You put it in the savings bond. Savings just soared. And you remember the first few months of COVID, savings soared. It's usually as low, maybe 4 or 5%. It soared to 15, 20, 30% per month. Huge increase in saving. Well, people couldn't get out to spend their money, so they were saving it. Uh, well, we had 4 or 5 years like that, and people saved it. They bought savings bonds. So when the inflation was just kicked down the road, we finally got it.
Yeah.
It started to come home, especially by 48, 49, because the troops were coming home, families were back together, and so people were starting to spend their savings now, and so all the inflation, here it came. Um,
Was there a big
so a
inflation in
lot
the
of the
50s?
Second World War was really actually paid for ultimately by inflation, even
Ah,
though the inflation was delayed by these savings bonds.
was there a lot of inflation in the 1950s? I wasn't aware of that.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Was there a lot of inflation in the 1950s?
Well, yes, we were getting it, uh, and in fact, there was a period of recurrent inflation problems. It's why Jimmy Carter had a terrible inflation.
Yeah.
He appointed Volcker to the Federal Reserve Board to do something about it, and Volcker he stopped it by interest rates went to 18, 19, 20%, and the housing market just it was wiped out at those high levels. Um, and 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 we don't seem to, and it's very hard to stop inflation without doing a lot of economic damage. And I think that's why it's so important not to create it in the first place.
Right.
You see, the Federal Reserve, of course, is seen, and they see themselves as riding to the rescue in inflation. They want to get it back down to no more than 2%. Well, the way to keep it for the Federal Reserve to keep it at 2% is to not inflate in the first place. They caused it. They always cause it, you
Yeah.
see, but these are separated in time and they're not linked together. And so they're always have this image of the white knight that's riding to the rescue. And and it's always painful when they
When the white
do
knight
that.
comes.
Well, do you think there was a scenario in which the inflation either wasn't caused during the pandemic, or at least it wasn't quite as significant as it is now as we see it?
Well, just do a mental experiment. Biden has announced an increase in spending, and suppose the Federal Reserve did nothing. Okay, that news would immediately tend to, with the news that there's going to be a bond issue, an increase in bonds floated by the federal government, that would depress prices and raise interest rates, and their money wouldn't go as far. You see, they've appropriated so much, and now they're going to have to. It's not going to be. That money's not going to go as far as they originally thought it was because of the reaction of the public. And so now, you see, in that world, government spending is determined by taxes plus the willingness of the public to hold treasury bonds and their willingness to take on a large stock of treasury bonds. And you would have an automatic, basically, market tendency to offset that. And you see, so that you can see in that scenario how when the Federal Reserve is monetizing debt and facilitating the government, that makes it easy for government to grow. Otherwise, its growth is going to be limited by what the citizens are willing to stand for. And if they're not willing to buy the bonds, then that's it. They have to live on taxes, you see.
It's
And
more of a
of
real
course,
market system then.
what's that?
It's more of a real market system. If the people are
Oh
willing to buy
yeah,
it,
it's
then yeah.
and it's equilibrating.
Yeah.
You see, that's going to set up forces. The government's announcement of a billion increase in spending is going to set up forces, you see, that resist maybe and perhaps partially accommodate that, but not 100% fully accommodate it, which is what the central bank does.
It seems like the common thread here is that the government keeps wanting to increase their spending. Do you think that the government generally, I mean, even in 2008 when we bailed out the banks, was that a good idea, or is it better if the government doesn't get involved in these things and lets the market?
Well, and
It's a tough
turned
one.
out the bail out of the banks, that turned out that they were bailing out the equity holders in the banks.
Yeah.
The depositors in the Great Recession. There's no evidence that the banks were in so much trouble that assets plus equity, bank equity, wouldn't have covered the liabilities. In fact, if you read Sheila Bair's book, what's her name of it? Now I've forgotten
That's right.
I've forgotten the name of her book. But anyway, she says that she was chairman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and they had several banks go under, but there was only one case, and that was IndyMac, was the only exception. All of those cases, bank assets plus equity plus prepaid insurance were sufficient that depositors were all made whole.
Nope.
And she claims that she never saw any evidence that wasn't did not also apply to the large banks. So that bailout was just the crybaby stockholders wanting not to take a hit.
That's
You see.
amazing. You don't hear that narrative getting out.
It was the biggest fraud. and everybody had this sense that, well, what they did was save us from a really bad collapse. Just, I'm sorry, that doesn't wash.
Wow.
There would have been a hit on equity,
Right.
and those shareholders would have taken it, and that may have had repercussions beyond that. I'm not saying it wouldn't have. It may have, they would have spent less and invested less, of course, but it's not. But the common shareholder, I mean, common depositor was not. And you see it because if they lose some of their money, you're going to have a major collapse.
Right.
And but there's no evidence that was a problem. None. And I trust Sheila Bair. She's very careful. She's very honest. She's very competent. And I think her book is a great study of that, an example of that.
That's astounding. It seems like the thing that allows us to continue to print this money and inflate our way out of things as much as we can is that the world uses the U.S. currency, right? And as long as the U.S. currency is the backer of the world, we can kind of not play by the rules of the rest of the world. But how long can that go on for?
See, that's enormously useful to the United States to have all these people wanting to hold. And you have to ask, well, how come is that true? Well, it's because almost all other countries do worse. You see, it isn't that we manage so well. I remember I gave a lecture in Prague, and this was years ago, and someone in the audience asked me if I was concerned about the dollar, the American dollar. I said, no, it doesn't. I'm not concerned about it. I said, we will mismanage it, but you guys will do worse. and you can't believe the outburst of laughter from that. I just inadvertently almost brought down the house because they all knew,
That's true.
Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, they all knew that. It's only Germany
I was going to say
and the
Germany.
Netherlands that are really strong, you see, and pay their bills and have strong economies and banking systems. The rest of them, and you now have the Eurobank, which is in the position of bailing out the bondholders in all of those countries. So that the whole of Europe has now got the same sort of problem that we have with our own Federal Reserve, except they have been really chiseling longer, and it's not clear that you can even collect taxes at Greece.
Yes, it seems to be
or in Italy.
Yeah, it seems to be a social construct that paying taxes or avoiding taxes is sort of the norm. So do you think that the idea of BRICS and this recent deal of Russia and Iran going away from U.S. dollar is really not a consideration in the scheme of things?
Right.
So in a sense, it's a blessing, and in a sense, it allows us to continue bad behaviors, right?
Well,
Like
that's
eating
why
candy and never getting a cavity.
I really welcome the experiments with Bitcoin and this sort of thing, because these are attempts to define a currency independent of any particular national monopoly currency that's self-regulating. But the problem is Bitcoin has to become a major currency in all transactions, you see, for that to work.
Do you think that it will?
And that's a slow process where, that means you have to, businesses and workers and people generally have to be prepared to accept Bitcoin currency payments in that. And then they can convert into whatever currency they want to, of course. But that one it seemed to me that held forth the potential for disciplining all of these government monopoly currencies. If people
Yeah.
use Bitcoin more for their transactions and these other currencies less, you see, that would force them in to be kind of basically regulated by the Bitcoin market. But that's it's really hard to do that.
Do you think that Bitcoin has a strong future? If you were to look into the future, do you think Bitcoin has a bigger role to play?
I think it has only potential, I think, and not any government is going to support it or want that to see that
Yeah.
happen. And well, and at one point, our own Federal Reserve was thinking about doing it themselves. See, that'll really kill it. That'll stop it cold because people can get Bitcoin, but it was just part of the same regulated
Right.
system.
The kiss of death. You know, it's actually a decent segue into bubbles. Is talking about Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin a bubble and a bubble in a market? And how do you know if you're in the middle of a bubble? Like, is the housing market right now? Are we in the middle of a bubble with a housing market?
Well, part of what Grant and I were talking about is kind of goes back to some of the things you've mentioned about fundamental value. And how do you
Yeah.
define fundamental value in the Bitcoin? And this is not to take us away from the idea of the bubbles, because
Well,
we have a
no,
lot.
it has no fundamental value. You see, its potential fundamental value is as a transaction medium.
Mhm.
And if it achieves that, that's enormously valuable.
Mm.
And the people who invest in Bitcoin will make out really well, you see, if that happens. But without that actually happening, it's all about expectations and the momentum in that market from just investors
Speculate.
basically buying Bitcoin because the price is going up,
Right.
you see, and that can't persist unless they get a breakthrough and it starts to be used for transactions. And
At which point it has fundamental value.
Right.
yes,
Yeah.
then it
Yeah,
has a
wider
fundamental
acceptance.
value because it's the transaction medium, and worldwide that's really valuable. There's huge value there because because it's coming from all countries. It's not just one country, you see. So it's potentially very substantial. But also, you see, most people are tied into their own national monopoly currencies and are accustomed to using that to pay their bills and to earn their income and their wages. And then you're not going to break them away from that very easily.
So for now,
Inflation has the potential for eventually doing that.
Hmm.
You see, if your currency is constantly being eroded and debased, then you may begin to catch on, and you might begin. So I think inflation is kind of a force tending possibly to make Bitcoin more attractive. But it's a big hurdle to go to a strange currency that people don't really understand or accustomed to view.
Yeah.
and so for now,
And what's a good currency? What's a good currency? It's a currency that you accept because you know other people will accept it. It's very simple.
yeah.
Right.
And the state, by making their currency a monopoly, then you have to accept it. And so people get accustomed to accepting it, and it has its own life and momentum.
Yeah.
So would you say until that happens, is that, to your question, to Grant's question of the bubble, how do we know that we're in the bubble? So until Bitcoin has that wider acceptance, do we consider that, because there are so many people investing it with the hope of the price of it going up, does that mean that we're more likely to be in a bubble?
Well, it's just its value is being maintained by these expectations. And when those expectations are really kind of permanently frustrated, then it's going to collapse. And of course it's up and down. It's had a huge variation. But and I have members of my family that just think it's the greatest thing and have bought some. And well, I haven't, because I'm not, I manage a portfolio of biotechs, and I follow that industry, and I've learned some stuff. That doesn't mean that I don't make a lot of mistakes, because almost very few of these startup biotechs make it. But if they do, you're talking about $100 stock that may be trading for $2 or $3 now. And in fact, I've had a couple that let's see, one went up, 35 times.
Well,
Okay. And another one went up about 4 or 5 times. And I have about 20 of these stocks. And I would say, well, over half of them are underwater. And the other half, there's a few with a little bit of profit, and then there's 2 or 3 with just lots of profit
yeah. It's almost like being a
that I
venture
haven't
capitalist.
sold yet. I haven't sold them yet because I don't think it's over, you see. And that's, and boy, that's a big guessing game, because one of the things I look at is whether the product has lots of potential patients.
Hmm.
Because, I mean, something like malaria or tuberculosis, or some treatment for treatment of diseases of the aged. Boy, that's a big market. You see, if you get one of those that works, I mean, worldwide, you see, my cohort, the 90s, is the fastest growing cohort in the world. Did you know that?
Congratulations.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the fastest growing, because so many more people are now living beyond 80 and up into their 90s. So I mean, it's surging, and the birth rates are low, so you're not having all that much at the bottom end. So it's a great growth, and it's because of all of these breakthroughs in medicine.
Yeah. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on the biotech, but something that I've heard people talk about within that industry is that you look for orphan drugs, so drugs that are for actually a smaller group of people, because then the insurance companies end up paying much more
Well,
per unit. Is that something?
oh yes, and I have some of those. And also another thing, oh yes, you can easily get treatments that cost $100,000, $500,000.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of treatment prices that you get. And know that I think that is viable. And also, you see, the learning from one breakthrough often has application in other diseases.
Yeah.
That's another thing, is that these things, and also once you get the thing approved and it's safe and it's out there, doctors start to prescribe it for other things,
Yes.
because now you have lots of experiments going on, right? And you're finding out that this helps a little on something else that was not part of the original testing. But once a drug gets accepted and is FDA approved, then people usually will start to find other things.
Yeah.
I might give you an example. My physician prescribed a medicine for me because he was part of a trial that involved a treatment for Parkinson's disease, which it turns out these Parkinson's patients that were on this medication didn't have macular degeneration in the eyes as early. It delayed. Well, I have wet macular degeneration in my right eye. I get injections about every 4 or 5 weeks. My physician, who knew about that because he does research and is often part of trials, he put me on this. I was on it for several years, and it could we don't know, but it could very well have delayed. You see, yeah. And so people discover these things, and so you see, there's a case where a doctor might write prescriptions normally only going to Parkinson's patients because they're trying to control macular degeneration, or who knows, maybe something else. And so anyway, I find it a fascinating industry, and I wouldn't, if I weren't investing in it, I wouldn't follow it that closely. You see, now I read everything that comes out that's kind of related to any of the companies that I've invested in.
Yeah, no, that's great. I've been trying. This is just a quick aside, but one of the first medical books that I edited was on Botox, and it was a long time ago. And what happened was we were training at Sloan Kettering, and we were using Botox for post-radiation fibrosis. And Botox is basically just a paralytic, right? It paralyzes muscle. And it came out first for blepharospasm, an eye condition. But then after it got approved, it was like this toy that it was this tool that all the different specialties started looking at and saying, well, what could I use that for? You have this thing that can paralyze muscle, and urologists used it, gastroenterologists, spine people, like everyone looked at it and said, hey, this is a fun, this is potentially useful in my field as well. So it's sort of like what you were saying.
Yeah, and out of that extensive use, people figured out the mechanics of it, that it's not just a paralytic, that there's some pain mediating factors in there as well, and so on and so forth. So
it has a life of its own, as you were saying. All right, so back to economics for the. So are bubbles something that are just a part of markets, that we're always going to have bubbles that we need to look out for? And is there a way we can tell that we're in one so we can avoid them?
Well, the first thing to notice is that you only have bubbles in things that can be retraded. If there's no market for reselling something, you don't have to worry. You never, and it's what people don't realize is that most all consumer goods cannot be retraded. It's about 75% of consumer goods. You buy them to eat them or use them or wear them or whatever, and you don't ever buy them for resale. And as soon as you introduce resale, and by the way, I learned this doing experiments, because we didn't understand the role of resale until we started to introduce it, and we were getting these crazy bubbles. And we told people what fundamental value was. It was based on dividends, and so there was this puzzle: why are people doing this? And so resale value can have a life of its own, and you particularly see that, in housing markets, because housing is a consumer good that lasts 75 or 100 years, something like. I mean, it is really durable, and there's a market for resale. So you get and of course. And the government is in there. They realize that one way to improve the welfare of households is to get them more into home ownership. And so the government is always in there trying to make people rich by getting them into homes. But the problem is that exacerbates the bubble. because it means easy credit than otherwise would occur. So we have these periodic, we had a pretty substantial housing bubble in the late 20s, particularly 26. And all you have to, and the detailed housing data is not as good then as it is now, but there is good data on mortgage credit flows as a proportion of new housing construction. And what's interesting is 1927, 28, and 29, the flow of mortgage credit exceeded the construction rate of new homes. Well, what does that tell you? That means it's going into leverage.
Yep.
People the equity's got to be falling, you see. And sure enough, we hit a wall in 29, 30, and housing then completely collapsed. I mean, there was a huge drop in housing prices from 1929 to 1934. I know because my family, after my father was laid off, we moved to a farm that we owned. The only reason why we owned a home was because my mother's first husband was killed in an automobile accident on the Santa Fe, and there was an insurance settlement. She got insurance money for that, and after she married my father, they invested that. And I don't know, I think they put some in the stock market, and then they used it to make a down payment and buy it on this farm. Well, when my father was laid off, we moved to that farm. So that's why I ended up, although I was born in the city, I lived for 2 years on a farm. And, it's a really difficult period for my parents, but a kid age 5 to 7 living on a farm, it was like heaven. You got to know the animals and the hogs and the cows and the chickens and there was lots of activity, work involving animals, and so to me it was just terrific. I had no playmates because the farmhouses are too far apart. It's not like living in a city and every evening you come home from school and you play with the next door neighbors. Oh, the next door neighbor was a mile away, you see, and also we had automobiles, but you didn't drive them that much. I mean, you basically use them only for work-related activity. But my parents lost that farm because the bank foreclosed on it in 1934, and in fact those Kansas farms, especially out in the West, they all ended up being owned by the banks. And of course, the banks, and moreover, the foreclosed farms are worth less than what they loaned on. So the banks were losing money too. Everybody. It's not as if they were making out well. They were not. And so there was just a huge number of banks that were failing because their assets were worth less, you see, than the credit they had advanced on them.
Seems like there's a cycle there. It seems like there's a cycle where like there was World War I, and then there must have been a lot of spending with that, and then a little later you get this housing bubble. Then you get World War II, and it kind of repeats itself.
Yes.
And then we get the, we have the. Well, I guess
was there a bubble after World War II? Was there a housing bubble after World War II?
Oh yes.
I think so, yeah.
There was, okay.
Part of inflation.
Yes. Yeah, there was the veterans were coming home. They were buying homes.
Is this just the cycle that happens where when there's extra government spending, you're going to end up with a housing bubble at the end of that? Because it seems like then, you had all the liquidity thrown into the market, and then the 08 bubble, and then we have the pandemic, and it seems like maybe now we're entering a little bit of a housing bubble as well. Is that a fair
Well,
cycle, or am
well,
I just making that
yes,
up in my head?
yes, and actually, and people, and I think that market doesn't really, because there is so much of that uh, government involvement in it, the market doesn't develop the kind of the institutions and procedure that will help to control it. Now, for example, uh, see, you can lock in a low mortgage rate, and in fact, that happens, and then your house starts to become valuable. And in fact, that is sort of a lock-in. People are reluctant to sell it because then they move and they got to buy another home and they pay a high mortgage rate.
Right, right.
Now the Canadian market doesn't. That they've relaxed that. You can't lock in these long-term rates.
Hmm.
There's, I mean, the contracts usually involve. Uh, it's probably the rates are geared more to the equity or something like. I don't know how, I've forgotten now. It's in my book, but I've forgotten what we wrote now about it on the housing bubbles. But the Canadian mortgage market works better than the American in that regard, in the sense that it's more likely to prevent those kinds of bubbles, or retard them at least. But the one thing in Austrian economics that I think was a contribution, and that's the idea that cycles are due to too much financing of long-term durable goods with credit. And housing is a perfect example of that. You see, they last a long time, and you're financing with credit, and that tends to have a natural peak and run out. You see, and then it tends to, so that so the more perishable thing is the less bubble prone it's going to be. It's entirely a property of durable goods combined with resale.
Right. And then with housing, we get the government butting in with mortgage rates and deductions and kind of artificially propping it up, which also contributes to it, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think?
Yeah, and you see, and if your congressman tells you he's going to get better terms for people to make it easier for them to buy homes, you vote for him. So it's always popular with
right.
the Congress.
There's
to do something to help people buy homes.
It's easy for us to blame the politicians, but it's also really blaming ourselves, right? Because we vote for
that
promised us the free stuff.
Yes, and because we somehow people believe that there are free lunches all over the place.
Right.
And of course, credit creation to buy treasuries is a form of free lunch for a while. But the inflation, you see, is always the thing that the inflation in wealth is an economic necessity, because it's a way of extracting from the economy the resources it takes to actually pay for that original consumption. And that's, I think, the way to think about what inflation is about.
Yeah.
Whenever the government pays its bills by creating money, you can expect major forms of wealth to decline in real value by whatever amount it takes to pay for that original expenditure. It's got to come from somewhere. And I think to me, that's a proper thinking model, you see, for what's going on. and it's potentially, I think, could be implemented to make predictions.
If you had a crystal ball looking ahead 10 years, are we still in inflation at that time?
Well, it's well, it's coming down because I think that original big pulse of spending
Yeah.
in 22, 23, we've backed off of that. But but the government's going to, if there's some new
Right.
spending priority that it has to face, we will get another pulse of inflation
Yeah.
because the central bank will dutifully support that the government's offer. They always do.
Yeah.
And and that's the problem. You see, it's the central bank combined with the government spending in excess of taxes that's the problem.
Yeah.
If the central bank didn't do that, it would tend to equilibrate.
Right.
And so one of the things that we were talking about in considering all these things, what happens if we're faced with another major crisis? Where is the economy now? And if the government needs to spend more money, are we facing another major inflation bump?
Well, of course, we don't, with a decline in private demand, and the government comes in and does the spending, we don't see inflation because there's pressure on prices to fall anyway, you see. So we don't, and normally when the government goes in there and increase a lot of money to raise demand, it's offsetting a decline in private demand because it's a declining part of a business cycle. And the thing is kind of unusual is, you see, we had COVID, and COVID created a supply problem. See, what we had is an exogenous decline in supply because people were sitting at home and couldn't get to work.
Yeah.
And what did we do? What did the administration do? They expanded demand. I mean, they just the opposite of what you. No, you don't. You don't expand demand when supply is falling. Of course, they later came around, and Biden was bragging about they're going to do something about supply chain problems. Oh, God, you don't want the government screwing around with supply chains. I mean, come on. The market will take care of that because there's a bottleneck somewhere, and that price will rise and tend to cure that bottleneck.
Yeah.
You just want to get out of the way and let the markets work in that case. And
With a lot of these things, the answer seems to be for the government to get out of the way. Something that we were talking about before was the role of the government with regulation. Like we sort of
the idea of the property rights, right? The idea of the property rights and the regulation by the government, but also allowing for the free markets.
And not just property rights, but also we want clean air, we want clean water, we don't want body parts in our meat. We want like all of this. So how do you think of the role of government with regulation? Like when should they get out of the way and let the market decide they don't want, et cetera?
Well, it just requires a really sophisticated electorate, I think, to see that, and to support free markets, and because of the recognition that that's the source of prosperity, that's the source of all wealth creation, and of course. And it's still one of the best articulation of that is Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. It's just a really, an incredible piece of work in that regard. But you see, it's invisible. The problem is that is not plain and obvious to the average person, and And what is obvious to him is that this politician will make it easier to buy a home, so you vote for him, or he's going to do something else to use government resources to make it easier for you, and so people are
But what about using
in
government resources to say, if you're going to sell, if you're going to sell chicken, that chicken can't be infected or can't have dirt in it, so that when you go to the store and you purchase the chicken, you know you're getting a clean chicken.
oh
Is that an
yeah.
important role of government, or do you think that people will just end up not wanting to buy the chicken that doesn't look right?
Well, of course, that's traditionally what they did. You didn't buy stuff that when you tried it, it wasn't any good. You
Right.
go back, and so
But some things you're not
Yes,
sure
yes.
about. It's hard to know until it's too late sometimes.
yeah. Well, how is the government going to solve that problem? Because it's it's got to come from the consumers. You could do test samples
Yeah.
with
Like
new
the
product.
FDA does, or the FTC.
Yeah, and in fact, my co-author Betsy Hoffman was part of a study uh, of examining the acceptance of a new product. And the new product was vacuum packed meat, because packed meat pieces it, uh, it just doesn't deteriorate near as fast. It lasts much longer. Vacuum packed. And well, but let's see, I think the problem was it would be discolored.
Hmm.
And so people look through the package and the meat doesn't look right because it looks discolored, but it's all right. So they did sort of a study of how people would accept the acceptance of that new product. And it really took it really took people training that people had to understand that the meat was okay, and it was actually better meat because it's going to last longer and everything. And but she was part of a project that were just, and also the question is, see, how do you market that so that the people are, I mean, the producers are making honest statements
Right.
about that they can be relied upon. So no, I think there is a room for that. I think
Yeah.
that's,
Is there
but also you have private initiatives that do that. I mean, what's Consumer Reports
Yeah. Sure.
except a program for better informing consumers about products,
Right.
particularly automobiles, which is a major investment. I remember always going to Consumer Reports when I bought a new car or something to see how they were rating them.
Oh yeah. Parents always did that
Yeah,
for everything, really. I mean, for any significant purchase, Consumer Reports was always consulted when I was a kid.
yeah.
Yeah, there were stacks of consumer reports just if you wanted to go back to some of the previous reports
Yeah.
to see. But is there a sort of a litmus test to know where the regulation should fall in between this wide spectrum of the Wild West and so many layers of red tape where the regulations are overwhelming? Is there a litmus test? Is there a right balance of that?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
There's a quick story that this makes me think of. My father-in-law, they came from Yugoslavia in the 70s. And when they got here and they bought their first house, he said the amount of paperwork in like 1980 or 76 or whatever was like, 4 or 5 pages. It was really small. They moved to Princeton in like, 20 years later or something. And he said to buy the house, the paperwork was like, stacks and stacks that you had
Oh
to have
yeah.
a lawyer go through them. And he's like, that's
Oh yeah.
not sustainable, right? You just like the amount of red tape is just
Oh yeah.
mushroom.
And that's simple now. All you have to do is the title company guarantees it.
Hmm.
And nobody ever looks at those anymore because they're guaranteed. And it's not clear that people will even know quite what to look for because they no longer are doing that. But you see that in fact that was a brilliant sort of market innovation. It's just the simple guarantee of title. You see, so as to not, and the transactions costs were horrible, terrifically large. You see, in those days. And I remember them, and you would have to wait until the deeds were searched, and people were looking for flaws, hidden
Right.
sort of time bombs, that
Yeah.
contingencies that were hidden. Well, now you just guarantee them.
So sometimes the market finds ways to solve these problems.
Yes.
There was a question that I was kind of desperate to ask you, which is, you were born in 27. Calvin Coolidge was the president. CBS was formed in 27. So you've seen a lot, right? You've seen the Great Depression and a lot of major world events, obviously. When I always wonder, as you look out in the world today, and there's so many conflicts, and it seems like there's lots of chaos and potential problems. And I wonder, is this a unique moment in history that we're under, or is this just more of the same?
No.
This is just part of the undulating history.
No. You see, I think that's a form of myopia.
That's what I'm asking. Yes.
Yeah. No, because we had a politician that easily out-trumped Trump. He was, except he was a Democrat.
Who was that?
Huey Long.
Oh, yeah.
Huey Long. I mean, Huey Long bragged about all the benefits he had provided for the people of Louisiana by his corruption. He used corruption to help the people. And he bragged about it, and they ate it up. I mean, they loved him. And his theme, you see, was he had this share the wealth theme. And he criticized Franklin Delano Roosevelt for not going far enough in helping the poor, from taking from the rich to help the poor, you see. And in 1935, he decided to run on a third-party ticket against Roosevelt. And it was announced. And at that time, he had something like 11 or 12,000 share the wealth clubs in the United States. These are spontaneous people getting together and creating in their local communities a share the wealth club. And these were all supportive of Huey Long. The guy had a huge popular support. And he was a terrible authoritarian. I mean, he just, he would have just run roughshod all over First Amendment rights and everything else. Well, he was assassinated, so we don't know what would have been the outcome. He announced this, and right away somebody took him out.
Would he have had it?
And so we don't ever know what, because it would have been a major challenge to Roosevelt to have this guy running on a third-party ticket because he wasn't doing enough for the poor. Come on, how's he going to answer that?
Right.
And in fact, there's, I think, pretty solid evidence that the Social Security system was more liberal as a result of the challenge from Huey Long. That is what Franklin Roosevelt was. He was more conservative in many ways than people imagine. You see, he came from a fairly conservative background and tradition, and then just kind of did what he had to do. And
was social
the more liberal person was his wife.
She was certainly very socially.
Eleanor Roosevelt was a champion of championed anti-discrimination, all kinds of things
Yeah.
that Roosevelt really uh, 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 handled because he wanted to hold the South, you see, the Democratic vote. So he did nothing for blacks really, but it was Eleanor who she was out there, giving talks and was very popular, in a way, kind of in tune with stuff.
She went on a across the country tour, right, to push his policies
Yes.
and push.
Yes,
Yeah.
and she wrote a very popular column called My Day.
Yeah.
My mother just
Ate it up.
loved to
Yeah.
read Eleanor Roosevelt. She was very popular.
Was Social Security a good thing for the country in the long run, do you think?
Well, yeah, I think with automation and by the way, all of the manufacturing that we lost, Trump wants to bring it back. It's going to come back. It's coming back anyway, but it won't create jobs because it's automated. You see, now it's machines.
Right.
And because I have a student, PhD student in economics at Arizona. His name is Richard Lee. And Richard was a good student. He had a good thesis on public goods, did a bunch of experiments. He got a job at Gettysburg College. And in fact, he was teaching there, teaching an experimental class, and he invited me to come and give a talk. And I went out and gave a talk. Well, he lasted 1 year because he saved enough money to start a business. and Richard Lee, he's just, well, at one point, he was, I tell you what he was producing and distributing was disposable medical products. And he designed these products in his Los Angeles office, and he produced them in Shanghai, where labor was cheap. Well, he now produces them all in the United States, and he doesn't use any labor because disposable medical products, you have machines, you see, that do that. And so he's become really quite wealthy. And the secret was he found a way to get into the hospitals.
Yeah.
To get the ear of hospitals buying this stuff. And of course now disposable, almost their stuff, they're just loaded up with disposable stuff.
Of course.
Yeah, it's big.
Containers, tubes, all these things. And then they just they use them and throw them away.
Yeah. That definitely has been the trend. Would you think if you talk about automation and automating and not creating jobs, but actually losing jobs, and if you extrapolate that into the near future, and there isn't going to be enough jobs for everyone, what are your thoughts on UBI, the Universal Basic Income?
Well, I just don't. I think it's just inevitable.
Yeah,
really.
See, and that it's going to come, and the problem is to get people into finding ways to occupy their time and to maintain their interest. People need to develop hobbies, all kinds of. You see, I write. I don't have any problem. I get up in the morning and I walk across from my bedroom to my office, and I've always got something to do, and so that sustains me. I'm that's very fulfilling for me, but people have to find ways to do fulfilling things for their time that interest them, and this can take it can involve sports, it can involve clubs, or I don't know,
So
but
it
I
sounds like what
think
you're saying, though, is that you think that the automation is going to be such that people won't have to basically be productive in the marketplace, and so we'll end up having to dole out payments,
well,
and then people can pursue leisure activities. Is that how you see it?
thing what's happening is that things can be produced without labor.
Yeah.
And so that means you have to have savings and investment and innovation to develop that, so that and that's a very highly productive activity. But for large numbers of people, I think it makes sense for there to be some sort of income supplement or that would sustain people, but they need to find, I mean, look at our drug problem.
Yeah. People need a purpose.
Well,
You
absolutely.
see,
You can't, yeah.
people are taking drugs, or they're boozing, or they're
Yeah.
doing something else, and so people have to find things meaningful to them for their lives. You see, that are satisfying.
You don't think that this is because some of the arguments against UBI have been, well, during technological revolution, people said the same thing. The conveyor belt was developed and people are losing jobs. And so, but this seems to be on a different scale, right? Because when the technology becomes so ubiquitous that almost everything is lost, then there's no need for workers.
Yeah. Yes. Now, of course, there's still services,
Mhm.
and I think we're seeing a lot of customized services developing, consultants and all kinds of, and there's room, I think, for that to grow. And I mean, in services in how to live a better life, for heaven's sakes. And it's
I saw a patient today who has a health concierge, and basically, her concierge goes around with her and makes sure that she understands what's happening and coordinates care. And so, this is something that I don't know if it existed. I haven't. It's not something that I'm used to seeing too much of, and I think these are some of the innovations that, it seems like one door closes to manufacturing and two more open in ways that we can't necessarily predict right now.
yes.
How do you
Well, and
sorry, how do you see the economy changing with people having this sort of a fixed income, or large groups of people having the universal basic income? Does that put them in the same category of people, same as people that are retiring and they're on a fixed income? And does that change the economy overall?
yeah, it just expands that sector enormously.
Mhm.
And well, for example, one of the things you read about now, if you're retiring, get a pet, get a cat, get a dog. I mean, they're discovering how important it is to have a relationship with an animal. You see, if you're no longer you're working, and so I'm not saying that's the answer, but it's one of a host of answers. You see, for people that are no longer spending most of a good bit of their time working, or having to do that. You see, so it's people have to just learn how to manage leisure time and make it productive for their own satisfaction.
Yeah. Having seen many people go through retirement, something that, like, some people really thrive and some people get just chewed up by it. And it seems like if you don't have a plan of how you're going to feel purpose in your life, then you can only play so many rounds of golf or go for so many walks. Like, you need some kind of purpose. Now, that's my fear with UBI, is the idea that, people just,
Yeah.
it's not enough just to have an income. You need to to be a productive member of society. But I suppose that, we'll find that in new and innovative ways that time will tell.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
society changes and the economy maybe shifts a little bit, do the old rules still apply? And what I mean by that in particular is, you used to think, like, if you're looking to save, if you're looking to invest money, the stock market, you could count on some amount of growth, 7, 8, 9, 10% over the long haul. Real estate was always a good bet. Are those things still going to be true into the future, do you think? Or if you were advising someone today about where to be investing, would you say you need to look for different kinds of revenue streams?
Well, yes, I think people want part of preparation for retirement is kind of learning more about how to invest your savings, and so that means learning something about equity and other securities markets, or buying a share in a business or something. And I have an acquaintance in California that has an olive ranch, and well, their crop was wiped out this year, and so it's really stressed them, and they're prepared to sell a 50% interest in the business in order to stay alive. Well, I'd do it in a minute if I was 60, or even 70. I asked my wife, and I said, "Well, are you interested in this? Because we could invest in that." Well, she's not. She does. She just doesn't. She's not interested in doing it. Well, so then you don't do it if you're not interested. But it's I just think that you see services and better use of leisure time. These are the things that need to expand as we replace traditional work making things with
Yeah.
machines.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, it
And listen, there's still room for plumbers and electricians.
for now.
And I just think we did young people the whole idea of loaning them money to get a college degree. Come on. No, a lot of people. I mean, so they get a college degree and then they couldn't get a job, you see. I mean, it's not a good choice for everybody at all.
Yeah.
And
Do you think that pendulum is swinging
plumbers and
away from that?
electricians, yeah, I mean, there's lucrative work and you don't need an education. You just need practical skills.
Yeah.
And my father earned good income all his life with an 8th grade education. And I think that still holds true, that you don't have to have a lot of education in order to find something fulfilling that you have some special skill for or adaptation for.
Yeah.
And there should still be room for those jobs for sure, but it's so hard to imagine a world a little bit further away with talking about UBI and just for some people just to be born into retirement.
Well, yeah,
But it seems like the UBI is a base, so that if you don't find your way clear to doing something else,
That you survive.
that you survive.
Right.
That sort of like a welfare-ish
Yes.
sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Could there was something I really wanted to ask. This is just I was so curious about this question because I understand you have a libertarian bent in you, I think. I was wondering
yes.
who is the best president in your lifetime, do you think?
Oh, Eisenhower.
Eisenhower.
Yeah.
Why?
Affairs of state could always await another round of golf. No, he was very wary of getting involved in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And in fact, in one of his famous speeches, he says that we have no business sending young Americans to get bogged down in an Asian war. And no, I think Eisenhower was he was the right president at that time. He was certainly my favorite.
Nice. Yeah.
And that probably was informed by his being a commander-in-chief after being an actual commander
Yeah.
in war.
Yeah. Warriors are often.
Well, yes, and
Yeah.
he was well, and all the evidence indicates that he was a people guy, that he really worked well with people, and he saw, like Julian Simon, that the real resource in America are humans, and he applied that in his in the military sphere. So it's yes, and I think it's well, and he the interstate highway system got started under Eisenhower.
Yep.
See, this network of highways was his, I would say.
So there
probably
you
his,
and that's a major government program. So it's not so there
Yeah.
are times when we need the government to step in and do things for us in a sense.
well, I except that I think that we should have a network of toll roads for you. In fact, I have argued for auctioning off the interstate highway system and auction it off to package routes so that you have a competitive routes, so that you don't have the same person buying
Monopolizing.
highways that enable you to all of the ways to get from A to B.
Yeah.
Okay, take any 2 points. You want to have more than one way to get from A to B, and those to be separately owned. So that would be the kind of the principle that would be involved in the auction system for that. But no, I think the toll roads are much better maintained. Look, our roads are terrible,
Yeah.
and we have a gasoline tax, but the
That's paying our Social Security.
Congress keeps raiding that money and
Yes.
spend it on other things.
It's just
But I think a toll system would and private road system would be terrific.
yeah.
And it could be done competitively, seems to me.
So it sounds like the economics and the politics are sort of intertwined in that way. To try to the way you think about economics, is that how you also does that translate directly into your politics?
Yes, the basic policy rule is whatever you do, allow for entry.
Yeah. Speaking of presidents, what do you think about I'm not sure if you've been following it, but the Javier Milei in Argentina, an economics professor?
I haven't followed that carefully, but of course his idea of going on the dollar is to, they just keep printing money to pay their bills. That's the
Right.
problem.
They're-
Well, it's the problem in America too. Everybody has it, except it's not as bad with us. So he sees going on the dollar as a way of limiting that. And
Do you think he'll be successful?
well, it'll be. I don't know. It means Argentina's got to pay taxes
Yeah.
to to fund their government, or they're willing to do that. They no longer can just simply take it out of whatever wealth they have through inflation.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any major, so if someone asked me in medicine, are there any major things that we can expect on the horizon? We would think about things like stem cells, personalized medicine. Are there in economics, are there major breakthroughs that are on the horizon that that people look to? Or I don't know enough about the field of economics to ask that question more intelligently, but are there things that we can be looking forward to that will reshape the way that we look at things?
Well, I tell you, the freshest thinking I've been exposed to the last several years isn't part of modern literature at all. It's Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments.
Hmm.
And in fact, I've just sent a manuscript to Paul Gray Macmillan. I think it's 577 TypeScript pages, and the title is Adam Smith's Theory of Society. And the basic theme is that what has created society is ordinary people learning to get along with each other by creating and following rules of, of, of engagement. And, and there's just two classes of rules. One involves beneficence, the other involves justice. Beneficence is about the good things we do for each other. Justice is about controlling the bad things we do to each other. Murder, theft, robbery, violation of contract, or the major. And so I realized, wait a minute, this whole theory of property is coming out of that. Because you see, you don't have property in your own body if murder is not controlled. You don't have property in the products of your body if theft and robbery is not kept under control. We don't have property in each other's promises unless we have enforcement of contracts. So that, I have realized that Adam Smith, particularly the theory of morals, it carries over into the Wealth of Nations, which of course kind of is the book everybody read, but the really great insights, I think, are coming are in the theory of moral sentiments, and it has to do with society and what creates order in society. You see, and the sources of order. And that's a theme in Hayek. And in fact, I first kind of got interested in those ideas through Hayek. But I've been led back to Adam Smith because this is where the champion is. This guy was an incredibly original thinker. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book on Adam Smith is because I'm interested in seeing people become more familiar with his thinking, and reading his work. And by the way, it's not utilitarian. He's not a utilitarian. You can, and that's a basic problem, I think, about the way we think about stuff today. You see, Adam Smith says, his model as to why we take account of others in our actions is because we want to get along with them.
Yeah.
It's not about, as he says, we do a lot of little utilitarian services for each other, but that comes from the fact that we have relationships, you see, and he's modeling the relationships, not the little services, the utilitarian stuff. And so in Adam Smith's model, everybody is strictly self-interested. But there's a difference between being self-interested and acting self-interestedly. See, those are not the same thing in Smith's model. Whereas the way we think about it now, if you're self-interested, that means you act in your self-interest. That's not the way he thinks about it. And it's
Can I interject one thing? It seems like he's interested in the self-interested, but how we define self-interested is just not purely economic, right? The people are self-interested to be part of society.
It involves this social. We're very social creatures,
right?
And we want to get along with others. And he says that means and here's literally what he says: That means we have to humble the arrogance of our self-love to bring it down to what other people will go along with. Well, that's the key to his whole model,
Yeah.
you see, and moreover, his propositions require people to be self-interested, because his proposition on beneficence says, he says, actions of a beneficent tendency that are properly motivated. That means I did this out of good-heartedness for you. He says, alone deserve reward because of the gratitude people feel for those. Well, you see, he gets reciprocity out of that axiom, essentially. See, so reciprocity comes out of these wanting to get along with each other. But notice his actions of a beneficent tendency. That means we all have to realize what's a benefit or what's a hurt. And in fact, you have to have common knowledge of what is a benefit, and you get that out of everybody's self-interested. People prefer more of a good thing, less of a bad thing.
Yeah.
So everybody has that. And so the propositions assume that, and out of it you see other regarding actions all over the place, and a sense of duty, and he says we don't love our country because just for its own sake. He says we love our country because it's made up of people that we love getting along with and that we interact with. He says that. So everything is coming from the bottom, you see, from rules that people follow. And it's really quite and of course, and the stuff he says about politicians sound like he could live today and find the same stuff still going on, you see. And
It is incredible that he's still so fresh, right? It's like, what does old
it
do
is,
again, in
yeah.
a sense?
Well, the thing, it seems that his insight is into human condition and into human condition within society. And as long as human condition within society stays, then if we look 500 years from now, and even if people are flying in their cars and medicine is Star Trek level medicine, it'll still hold true, because
Yeah.
as long as we have society and we have humans in it, it'll still
Look on the basic level, sort of like it is now. Yeah.
could be contemporary.
And he has a great passage where he talks about, he says, heaven in its anger has endowed the poor man with a desire to be rich, to emulate the rich. He thinks that's the source of happiness. You see, and then he goes into about how all of these people that have a lot of wealth and they're unhappy.
Yeah.
But it really is about morality and the morality of our actions, and and how that morality comes from desiring to expand the beneficial results for others and then limit the hurtful results. So it's all about increasing happiness through benefits, reducing unhappiness by reducing hurt. And of course and it gets into war and conflict, because those are all the source of hurtful.
It seems like in a strange way to me, as you're describing this, it seems like understanding Adam Smith in that way is a bit of where you came in with experimental economics, right? Because there's the purely conceptual, that we're all acting in our self-interest and everything is sort of cool, calm, rational actors. And then there's the actual messy reality that we all have all of these other interests and motivations. And unless you test it in a lab or test it in some kind of experiment, either real world or otherwise, then you don't really know how people are going to be acting in those situations.
Well, yeah. And in fact, Adam Smith's proposition on beneficence explains behavior in one shot trust game. I mean, there's no other model explains it. Because you see, game theory can't explain that because it's a single play. Why if someone passes, does the first mover pass to
Could you
person
describe
two, and I
the
can
trust game?
cooperate and we both benefit, or I can defect and take all the money? Why don't people defect?
Yeah.
They're not. Two-thirds of the second movers choose the cooperative outcome. You can't explain that, except Smith does.
Yeah.
His proposition on beneficence tells you it's because of the gratitude.
And
You
for,
see,
for those who don't
the
know,
first mover didn't have to move to the second mover.
right?
He's not required to do.
Yeah.
If he does, he can see that the guy can take all the money. He does it anyway. And are you going to screw that guy over? Well, a third of the people do, but at a ratio of 2 to 1, people
Yeah.
don't do that.
And-
And so there's something here that there's a truth here that he has captured.
It's
And
so
I tell you, Bart Wilson and I, it got our attention because we were using Smith in our classes and signing it. And then one day we realized that and we could explain trust and ultimatum games. In fact, we have a variation on the ultimatum game where it's the person doesn't have to play the game. He can voluntarily not do it, and about 5% don't. But of the ones that do, it changes the result completely. I mean, because we realize, because see, Smith has a proposition. His second proposition on beneficence is that beneficence is always free. It cannot be extorted. Therefore, lack of beneficence, there's the failure to act beneficent, he says, does no real positive evil, and people won't punish it. He's right. In the lab, they don't punish that. Whereas in the trust game, if I pass the human defect, boy, will they come back and punish that if they have an alternative, if they have the opportunity. Yeah, they'll punish that so he's got propositions that explain when and when people will not engage in the punishment of something seen as hurtful. And it's incredible. Now, people in those games don't always read each other in the same way. So in fact, his model has, his propositions often have a bunch of moving parts, so that there is room for slippage depending upon payoffs and as well as personality types and pay. But it's just a really rich source of theory for predict, because his propositions are all predictive. They're very operational. It's just they're terrific.
yeah.
Just a quick request, just for our listeners that are not familiar with the trust game. Could you describe the trust game?
Oh, okay. It's a 2-move game. Let me give you the form in which we originally did it, because we've done a lot of variations on it since. But and this was Kevin McCabe and I first did these experiments, and it was about 1990. I think the first one was in 89. And okay, there's maybe 12, 16 people in the room, and suppose there's 12. Then there's 6 pairs, and you are randomly matched with somebody else in the room. You'll never know who that is. And then you randomly are assigned to either player 1 or player 2. And then when that's done, okay, now you're matched with someone. And here's the game. And we have a little game, we have a extensive form tree that illustrates it. So person 1 moves first. They can move right, and player 1 and player 2 each get $10. And the game stops. Or player 1 can pass to player 2. The $20 stakes become 40. And the idea is there's some synergy between the two individuals. So together they can produce more, create more uh, satisfaction or benefits, wealth than a loan. So it doubles to $40. Okay, person one can move right, give $15 to person one and take 25, or he can move, that's right, but he can move down and take the whole $40 and give nothing to the first guy. Well, we did that experiment, and 3/4 of the people were moving right. Only 1/4 were defecting. And it's a single play. It's all over there.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's really nice.
And we tell them, and you'll never know who you're matched with. I mean, you have complete anonymity. We're just, it's Al Roth. Al Roth once accused us of actually almost telling them what to do.
Because he didn't believe the results.
Because we're just inviting, it's okay to take the money,
Yeah.
see? Well, but people don't.
Right. Have people looked at the different personality types that are more likely to take the money or not? Has that been a field of research?
The best explanation is Adam Smith. He says actions of a beneficent tendency that are properly motivated, and that means intentional.
Yeah.
You see, create gratitude. And in fact, notice in the English language, we have a phrase. It's called debt of gratitude.
Yeah. Sure.
Where did that come from? Why is there a phrase debt of gratitude in the English language? Well, Adam Smith, he would say, I told you so. I told you where that came from. He's got a proposition, you see, in which that is a
form of currency almost.
There's a theorem that says that is the consequence.
Yeah.
That there's a debt of gratitude. And her actions of a hurtful tendency that are improperly motivated. That means I hurt you, and that's what I intended to do. He said, a loan cause. Cause resentment and punishment, and the desire to punish. And he said, the urge to punish, he said, is so strong that if people actually bump their body against a stone, they'll strike out at it. And it's just like, people that bump their head on a beam and they hit the beam.
I've done that.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
But the thing about Adam Smith, he's got these examples. He can tell you why it's happening and give you. See, he convinces you that this is really fundamental. It's so fundamental that you hit the beam if you bump your head on it.
Right.
Even though he says it's inanimate, he says it's silly, it's witless, because it's an inanimate object.
Yeah. Yes.
You see, but that is so ingrained in people, and this is the source of justice, because it's through punishment we try to deter hurtful action. And so his whole theory, you see, kind of justice is coming out of the need to control these hurtful actions, and of course they can escalate. You never have people escalating reciprocity beyond control. That's always limited, but on the downside.
The Hatfields and McCoys.
Yeah. And he said, and he's got this fundamental proposition, the asymmetry between our joy and our sorrow. He says anybody reasonably situated has far more to lose than to gain. He says the distance between anyone's kind of baseline and the highest level of prosperity that he might rise to is nothing compared by the amount by which he can decline. Because on the downside, you not only have loss of wealth and health, but friends and associates. Reputation is lost. Right. And so he has this, there's social aspects of everything in his model, where others, you see, are are really an important part of the calculus of our decision making.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very, very interesting. Do you think that there are some barriers, and it's great that you've put out this work. There are some barriers to the language because the language
In
sort
Adam
of
Smith.
in Adam Smith, because you actually provide one example where he refers to fellow feeling because
Yeah.
we didn't have the empathy. The word for empathy didn't exist at the time, right? Do you think
Right.
that is in some way a barrier?
Well, and I think it's terrific that word didn't exist because he talks about mutual simultaneous fellow feeling. You see, that drives a lot of the rule following and the things that make us human. You see, and that account for all sorts of actions which don't require people to be unselfish at all. I mean, people are all self-interested, but it's a way of smoothing our lives, and we get, and just as in the Wealth of Nations, he talks about gains from trade, and then we get a whole lot more back than we give through markets. Well, but the same thing is true in our neighborhoods, you see, because he's got an exchange approach to that, in which we get a whole lot more back because of the gratitude people feel for the things we're doing for them. And
I didn't realize how much
they
technology.
return that 10 times over.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's really neat how Adam Smith, I didn't realize how much psychology infused his work. And it's kind of, to me, it's sort of it's a cool bookend that you and Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize. Essentially, it seems to me like for putting a lot of that psychology back into
Yes.
the economy again. And you're such a fan of Adam Smith, obviously. It's a really beautiful circle.
But I can't get Danny to read it. Well, I told him, in fact, I recently sent him some stuff, and he thought that was very interesting. Well, I mean, it's just amazing because you see all of that, because a lot of the Kahneman and Tversky work, had to do with asymmetry between gains and losses.
Yeah.
That's a big part of what they did. It's very fundamental to Adam Smith's theory.
Yeah.
You see, the asymmetry between, and he derives asymmetry between gain and loss from asymmetry between joy and sorrow. It comes right from a social psychological model of human action.
Yeah.
And and he gets propositions out of it that are all predictive, and I'm telling you, they you test them, they work.
So young econ students out there, go grab your Adam Smith, and right, and really, really dig into it. That's great.
Yeah.
I think we've got you've been so gracious with your time. There is one question that I feel like it would be podcast malpractice not to ask you. And I've heard people ask this before, but I'm gonna throw my hat in the ring too. You're 97 and you're I mean, obviously amazingly fit, and you're mentally completely there. What's the secret to being 97 and still producing and being so productive?
Well, a lot of it comes from my family,
So pick your parents well.
my grandparents were active in the sense that they were interested in ideas and thinking, and three of my four grandparents lived into their 90s, early 90s, 91. I think Grandpa Smith had turned 92. See, my father's father outlived all of his children,
Wow, that's
and
kind of tough.
it was
actually.
hard on him. It
Yeah.
was very hard. The guy, I mean, it was. Grandpa Smith lost a daughter in 1918. She was 18 years old and she died of Spanish flu. And then she had these two older brothers, my father and his brother. And and they both died of heart attacks in their 60s. But they were smokers, for heaven's sake. They blew it. I mean, they had good inheritance.
Yeah.
But they blew it. And of course, that's one thing I think we've learned is that the data are just overwhelming on that. The smoking
Sure.
reducing lifespan. From so
Do you actually?
I get up in the morning and I have a lot to live for that day because I've got a job to do.
Yeah.
And I have something that excites me. I've got to finish this paper I'm working on or whatever. And I've really enjoyed doing this book because it's just, I just have rediscovered, you see, all this wisdom in Adam Smith that's not part of what I read about Adam Smith. And of course he's appreciated in terms of what he had to say about economics. His model of economic welfare, you see, was absolutely right on. Well, but he has it's far broader than that, and it's in that first book.
Yeah.
And also to some extent in the lectures on jurisprudence. Of course, he didn't write that. Those are the lectures on jurisprudence are based upon two fat sets of notes that somehow were preserved by students, and the first set came on the market in 100 years after Adam Smith died. It came on at auction. Here was this cardboard bound set of notes, real thick, you see, and they're beautiful notes. And then in the early 30s comes on the market a second set, and these are even better notes than the first.
Wow.
And so that this book is on lectures on jurisprudence are these two big sets of notes. And some of the notes are on exactly the same topic. It's just repeated in a later lecture with some variations and maybe some different examples or something like that. And I find that book it has some insights that are not in either of the other books.
Were there any specific insights that you found really insightful from the lectures on jurisprudence?
Yes. Let me give you an example. Smith said that in early governments that were the governments were quite weak and decentralized. And the basis for those governments, they depended very much upon the support of families, especially powerful families. And so the authorities in these early governments were very concerned to not deviate from the norms that had traditionally been followed in these communities. And he said, for example, the worst crime was murder. Well, suppose your son murders my son, and they catch your son. Your son and your family is brought to me and to my family to decide what's to be done. And typically we work out a deal. There would be compensation in which you transfer some land or some assets to me if there's assets involved, or some work. Or if you don't hardly have anything, then your friends will be tapped to make contribution. In other words, you had victim compensation, the punishment was in the form of compensation, a direct transfer. And he says this was the way you maintain stable communities, because this had been the traditions that people felt. He said the modern state separates that, and any criminal act becomes a crime against the public, and there's punishment that's levied. And he said we've just completely lost this notion that the perpetrators of crime have some obligation to partially make whole the victims.
Yeah.
Of these.
There's civil penalty. I mean, there are civil lawsuits, like where the family sometimes sue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, of course, a lot of we have settlements out of court that involve transfer of resources. It isn't that we do a lot of those things, but his point is this was something very early in human experience.
Yeah.
This is not something new that's created by the legal profession or in America, and it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And all cultures share a lot of commonality. You see, I think Smith's idea, when you observe different cultures, I think his basic model was these are cultures just in a different stage of development, that we kind of all go through the same. I think he would have thought cultural difference is just a difference in time and history.
Yeah.
That because humans go through common forms of experience and develop common forms of solution to these problems.
Yeah, there are some timeless themes. Thank you.
I guess, are we talked out?
Honestly, we have pages and pages that we could, but I think we've taken up more than our share of your time. So we really appreciate you taking the time. There's a lot to digest there. I might go back and watch it again just to kind of let some of those concepts soak in.
And do two things: probably pick up Adam Smith, and also wait for your work to come out. Because that would be
okay. Well, the manuscript is Palgrave Macmillan has it, and I take it busy editing it, and I will get back and edit, and I'll be doing proofs probably within the next few months. And so, I'm excited about it. I think
we'll be on the lookout for that.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Please let us know when it comes out, and we can get it out there as well as much as we can. And
okay. Yes.
Great.
I will. Yes.
Let's go
try
back
to
to
do that. And if you don't hear from me, ask me. Remind me.
Yes, we'll do.
Ask me, is it out yet?
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Friends, thank you for your attention. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you find value, please remember to hit the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on the notifications so you can stay up to date with everything going on with the channel. And please leave us a comment, let us know what you thought about the show and also what you'd like to hear about in the future.